When you think of living on Mars, do you think of Black Lives Matter? Are you inspired to confront your ableism or to dismantle your idea of space as a frontier? If so, or if not, you've got something to learn from a group of woke academics on decolonizing Mars. And that's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. All that was missing to prove the organizers' devotion to diversity was a woman in a niqab. It was a day-long public event held last September called Becoming Interplanetary: What Living on Earth Can Teach Us About Living on Mars. In general, it was an exercise in imagining a future different from and better than the present. The event was held at the prestigious Library of Congress Kluge Center in Washington, D.C. The Kluge Center, which was founded in the year 2000 by a $60 million donation from its benefactor John Kluge, offers scholars the opportunity to use the well-stocked library and to interact with members of the U.S. Congress and the public. Its purpose is to, quote, bring together the world's best thinkers to contribute to the conversation about the challenges facing democracies in the 21st century, end quote. There's a link below to the entire Becoming Interplanetary day-long discussion, which I think is mandatory viewing for anyone who cares about the educated imagination in the United States and how thoroughly it has been colonized by identity politics. I'm going to focus today on the first panel of the conference, which was called The Right Stuff, obviously in allusion to the film of that name based on the Tom Wolfe book about the pilots involved in aeronautical research at Edwards Air Force Base and those ultimately selected for America's first manned space flight. Space travel has long been thought to represent much that is good and even glorious about America, the triumph of human ingenuity and daring over the constraints of space and matter. But that was emphatically not the focus of this panel, or even a small part of it. You can hear the condescension from the very first sentence of the panel description. Here it is. Quote, Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, cemented the ideal of the cowboy astronaut, drawing on the frontier themes that have long been used to talk about space. How do these narratives of space exploration inform and influence modern ideas about who can explore space? What does it mean to have the right stuff, and how is that meaning evolving? End quote. The implication is that the common notion of space travel must evolve because it has been, until now, little more than a cowboy story with the white male heteronormative frontier assumptions that have limited who can explore space. The implication being that many who might have contributed have been prevented from doing so. It's a rationale for resentment from beginning to end. As so often now in academia, the discussion is not actually about space travel or living on Mars, but about the narrative of space travel and how it embodies white supremacism and other isms that must be resisted worldwide.
Thank you, everyone, so much for being here today. I have some brief opening remarks before we get to our first wonderful panel. I wanted to begin with a Territorial Acknowledgement, which I will read from because I cannot memorize anything. We acknowledge the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples, whose traditional and unceded territory we are gathered upon today. Gathering here, we pay respect to the elders, both past and present. We acknowledge the grave harm that colonialism brought to these lands, and in particular the erasure of both Indigenous and African identities under not only slavery, but racist laws that segregated all peoples into the binary classification of white and black. We honor those who have lived and do live now at the intersections of identity and experience, which we will be exploring today. We also honor and thank Piscataway Indian leader Chief Turkey Tayak, whose leadership in the Indigenous social justice movement of the 20th century played a pivotal role in reclaiming Indigenous identity, not only here, but in communities allied with the American Indian movement for self-determination around the world.
The session was set up so that the panelists each made an opening statement and then spoke generally in response to questions from the chair. The first panelist was Brenda Child, a professor of American Indian history at the University of Minnesota. And you can bet it was no accident that she was placed first, just as it was no accident that the session began with a territorial acknowledgement and an apology for colonialism. It was also no accident, I suspect, that there were no white men on the panel or in the entire three-panel conference. The shaming and exclusion of white men is now an explicit part of the Decolonizing Academy. Black, Indigenous, and Muslim men are allowed a place if they ally themselves with feminists in attacking so-called white male privilege, but in general, the Academy today, and certainly the discussion on this panel, is about replacing male excellence and rationality with intersectional feminist moral posturing.
So Native people have been travelers for quite a long time, and we have had, of course, some famous Native people who've been travelers. You probably know, thinking about this part of the world, that Pocahontas traveled from the Chesapeake to London. She's probably one of the most famous of Native travelers. And there's, if you head over to the NMEI and you see the Americans exhibit, there is a large story about Pocahontas and how she's kind of played into American history and even American imaginings of Native people. There's another famous traveler that I often think about, a man named Black Elk, who was a Lakota, who traveled to Europe to perform in the Wild West shows. And this was a fairly common experience. I have a friend who's just written a book about Indigenous London, about the early Inuit and other travelers from the Americas who came, sometimes involuntarily, sometimes at their own will, to parts of Europe.
Professor Child's presentation was not explicitly concerned with space exploration or Mars, which is not surprising since her area of expertise is Indigenous education and history. She told us that Indigenous people have traveled extensively, specifically by canoe, and mentioned some Indigenous people who traveled to Europe in earlier eras, though not by canoe. Her main point was that we need to shift the paradigm of how we understand exploration. In particular, we need to stop seeing Native peoples as the objects of exploration and see them instead as active agents. By extension, the point seemed to be that those who have not been involved in any manner in space travel should be seen as just as important to it as those who have, which is perhaps the main reason why Professor Child was on the panel in the first place. The second panelist was Professor Bryan Nord, senior member of the Kavli Institute for Cosmological Physics and leader of a team of researchers at the University of Chicago applying artificial intelligence to questions in cosmology. Unlike the first speaker, it would seem that Professor Nord would have a great deal of knowledge about the panel topic, but we never found out what it was.
If we're going to consider if we're going to think carefully about how we're going to go out there, if we're going to refocus who we center, we need to ask how we've been doing it here and if we're ready for that change, and if we're ready to say we're going to go out there and try to be something different out there. What makes us think we can do that if we weren't ready to be something different here? I think we're here right now on Earth with these new technologies. We're at an inflection point, and we have a decision to make about whether we are going to continue to allow power to accumulate through these technologies, or if we're going to find a way to shift that power to folks who haven't had it before.
Professor Nord's main focus, if he can even be said to have had one, was the lack of social justice on Earth, which has led, it seems, to a disinclination on his part to imagine any expedition to Mars. He spoke of our failure to refocus who we center. The main philosophical question related to a possible Mars mission seemed to be for him, quote, will we allow power to continue to accumulate, or will we shift it to folks who haven't had it yet, end quote. The implication being that until we can shift power to other folks, the time has not yet come to imagine living on Mars, though it was not made clear how shifting power to folks who haven't had it would aid space travel or would make for a more just and inclusive society. Judging from the members of this panel, it will lead to overt bigotry and race-based discrimination. The third panelist was Dr. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, now of the University of New Hampshire, also an astrophysicist and the one with the most to say about herself as a scientist, specifically as a light-skinned black woman and one of only a very few black physicists working in the United States Academy. Bryan Nord, it turns out, also identifies as black. But again, she had little to say about her actual research in relation to space exploration.
So because I am a Black and Caribbean American, descended from slaves, I'm more familiar with the great law of the Iroquois than I am with any moral rules that my African ancestors lived by, because I'm actually not sure who my African ancestors were. And my basic understanding of this law is that it teaches that we must consider the impact of our actions on those who will live 7 generations from now. And I know that when colonial processes begin, no one is really thinking of the next 7 generations. It's just not how colonialism works. And so because of this, the list of anxieties that I experience when thinking about the right stuff is really about whether we have the right stuff. When I think about humans arriving on another planet like Mars, questions I'm asking myself, and when we go to the moon, which is actually one of the first destinations, I think, could mining on the moon forever alter how future generations see this majestic and natural satellite of Earth? Who will profit? Who will perish in the expedition? Will such missions ultimately exacerbate inequalities that already exist on Earth? And in fact, will missions to Mars make life on Earth worse? How can we have these conversations with a language that refuses to entwine itself with the lingua franca of settler colonialism? So discovery, exploration, settlement, colonizing. You dig a little bit deep and these words come back to settler colonialism.
Mars, for Professor Prescott-Weinstein, is best approached through the lens not of a high-powered telescope, but through the grievance-highlighting lens of post-colonial theory, where the framing questions are always pretty much the same ones. Will space research exacerbate existing inequalities on Earth? She made much of how the very words discovery, exploration, and settlement have a deep history of violence, and therefore how problematic it is to use them. Academics like Chanda do love to reveal their deeply sensitive moral natures. Prescott-Weinstein told us that whites visited colonial apocalypse on the indigenous and speculated that the Mars mission might be merely another form of white colonial exploitation. She didn't mention whether the indigenous visited indigenous apocalypse on their neighbors or whether blacks have any significant history of violence that might diminish their imputed moral preeminence. What meaning, Dr. Prescott-Weinstein asked, does a mission to Mars have for making Black Lives Matter or for Idle No More? The implication, as with Professor Nord before her, is that we should not think about going to Mars or about much of anything else until Black and Indigenous peoples are equitably represented in any scientific project. The final panelist, Professor Ashley Shue from Virginia Tech University, spoke about disability. Astronauts in space are themselves disabled, she asserted, suggesting that people who live with disabilities have much to teach astronauts, an intriguing idea that she didn't develop, and an idea somewhat in contradiction to her other claim that it is incorrect to assume that there is anything wrong with people who are disabled.
So I work on disability narratives. So what would I be doing here? The assumption with the right stuff is that disabled people aren't. They don't have the right stuff. My particular work is on techno-ableism, meaning I think a lot about how the narratives of technology that we have often reinforce ableism, and sometimes do this by using the language of empowerment to cover up an ableist narrative about disabled lives that would see us as defective and needing to be fixed, but oh yay, technology. So a lot of the ways in which I think about how disabled people have or have not been included in what counts as having the right stuff, it takes 3 different veins.
Shu mentioned that deaf people were used in research into motion sickness in space, but that these same people were not considered for recruitment as astronauts, presenting this latter point as if it were an example of unjust exclusion. Actually, she suggested that there is something unjustly exclusionary built into the very idea of having the right stuff for going into space, because that suggests that we know what the right stuff is and that we value that rather than valuing, as she suggested we should, a variety of people who might have, quote, all kinds of stuff, as she put it. Here we came to a truly radical and bizarre affirmation that as we think about space exploration, we should unlearn the ableist idea that specific abilities should be valued, as if there could ever be any successful project that was not highly discriminatory and purposefully so discriminatory of the inept, the malicious, the self-aggrandizing, the destructive, the lazy, and so on. Professor Shu didn't exactly say that it is unethical to value anything over anything else, since obviously she valued her own analysis. But she certainly did indicate with quite remarkable assurance that the traditional qualities prized in space missions have been a product of able-bodied bigotry. Following these opening remarks, there was a more general discussion in which the panelists elaborated their positions, and I won't go into detail because mainly they spoke more along the holier-than-thou lines already indicated, implying that everything American scientific research has ever prized has had an element of the oppressive. There was much abstract talk of transforming academic institutions. The only material aspect of space exploration that the panelists were interested to talk about was the difficulty of, as they called it, pooping in space. Pooping excited them and caused much hilarity because it de-romanticized the ableist white male narrative of the astronaut, the conventional story of intense training, hard-won knowledge, dedication, self-sacrifice, true grit, and commitment, elements they never once praised or even acknowledged. The focus on poop showed the astronaut in a humiliating light, brought him down to earth, so to speak, made him or her no more special than anybody else, and that seemed at least partially the undeclared agenda of this panel. Near the end of the general discussion, Professor Child, the professor of American Indian history, mentioned that Native Americans are forever having to remind those they call settlers that, quote, we are the ones from here. You are all from someplace else, end quote. End quote. Very inclusive of her. She mentioned that her people like to joke amongst themselves about the settlers leaving. Perhaps they'll create a joke, she said, in which the settlers will go to Mars and leave the indigenous people with their ancestors. The clear implication being that that would be a glad day, with lots of appreciative chuckles from the panel and the audience about the disappearance of all the non-indigenous from North America. It's impossible to imagine white professors joking about the disappearance of indigenous peoples as part of an elite panel on the philosophy of exploration. Professor Child's lack of embarrassment, as she told her crude joke, summed up for me the moral and intellectual shallowness of many of those who are held up as leaders in the academy today, as resentment and blame take the place of useful analysis. What such academics will accomplish in their quest for social justice remains an open question, apart from the utter ruin of the university as a merit-based and truth-seeking enterprise. That's for certain. But if they ever do mount any kind of Mars mission, or actually any mission at all where excellence matters, I know I'd feel a whole lot better with the cowboys.
Time for one last question. I see Tree in the back there.
So, assuming that we do indeed want to colonize Mars, we want to give the first colony every chance of success. And it could still fail even if we do everything right. So it takes resources to put people into space, and picking the people most likely to succeed is critical to reducing the risk. So I think that it's been a point well made that it's a very prickly question to ask, but what are the characteristics of the optimal first colonist? How do we pick those people?
Depends on whether your goal is actually colonization, right? I think I probably want someone who doesn't think about it as colonization. I'm sure that Donald Trump disagrees with me about that.
Anyone else? All right. Well, let's thank our panelists again.